So without further ado, I think I'll introduce Doug Larry, who can talk a little bit about his run for registrar in Windham.
Thank you, Ronna. Low-cost media. As Ronna suggested, I'm Doug Larry. I got interested in being a registrar of voters when I worked on Jean's campaign. I found it fascinating, given my background in data, how poor the voter registration data was, particularly for people who do not own property. The 8,000 people in my town who are renters have atrocious data. Their addresses are wrong, perhaps even intentionally wrong, and are entered in a way that they don't sort correctly when they're printed out in the folders. So if you're walking house to house in the apartments, you don't get a clear list of who's in the next house. And if you show up to vote and are a renter in Windham, your address is messed up so it doesn't sort well, and you're hard to find. The cumulative effect of this is renters are discouraged from voting in my town. Property owners have much clearer addresses that sort because they rarely have a letter involved in their street address. It's a simple data problem. There are two fields for your street number, the number and any unit identifier, A, B, second floor, etc. But when they're both shoved into the number field ceases to work. If you're on a street that has odd and even sides that are in different districts, you may even be misidentified for which polling site you should go to. Or if the high range and the low range are in different polling sites, you can get kicked around town to where you should vote. And of course, if you're trying to get voters to understand that you're running, and you send to one of these bad addresses, you'll find that you have the wrong zip code, because these same numbers are used to automatically generate the zip +4, which is what gives you less expensive mailing. And so you get a very high rejection rate on the renters' addresses in my town. So there's an entire data integrity problem to be solved. I found in my town that Jean and I were the first people that tried to get information back out of the system as data. On a little USB drive, you can get all the voter information of your FOI and other circumstances, but the data is not much good. In our town, it's embedded with a lot of extra commas, for instance. Typical abbreviation for Mr. or Senorita has a period, perhaps, after the SRA or the MRS. But if you type comma, which is immediately adjacent on the keyboard, you introduce a flaw in the data that pushes all the other fields to the right. And this makes working with the data quite difficult. And many Hispanic voters will get data that doesn't sort correctly and thus get ignored. They'll get put in the wrong polling sites, for instance. So these are things I could see that I thought needed a little fixing up. And I know a bit more about data than the average person. I worked at IBM and Harvard, and I rather like big data. And it bothers me when it's bad. It bothers me more when it's used politically bad. Property owners get their data fixed rather often, and the renters do not. The renters move 3 or 4 times in between these presidential elections, and that's the only time that they show up in many cases. But when they do, they'll be given a much harder time this November than the typical property owner. So that was one of the things that motivated me to run for this office. I mentioned to the Green Party that this looked like a fairly easy position to get in some towns. Much like Hartford has a working families registrar, because of the extreme ratio of Democrats to Republicans, you can come in second, which is what it takes to be a registrar, by beating the Republican in Hartford. Likewise, I think in Windham, though it's not as easy as it might be in bigger cities like New Haven, where Caleb is running in a 6-to-1 environment between the Democrats and Republicans. In my town, I'm running in about a 4-to-1 Democratic-Republican ratio. I need about 18% of the vote to come in second. But still, 18% isn't a terribly tough goal. Heck, you need 50%. That's got an easier race. And I would encourage the parties, particularly small parties, to think about this as something that's doable. You're not picking out the second major party, you'd be a third. And I think that we'd all be well served by having a bit more talent in some of these offices. They're currently party patronage jobs, and the qualification for getting the job is usually how many phone calls did you make, how much money did you raise. It's not how good are you with data or even people. So I had the petition to get onto the ballot in my town, and I carried 3 petitions. Overachiever, you might say. I carried a petition for no party at all. I carried a petition for the Green Party, and I carried a petition for a very, very small local party in Windham called the Bottom Line. The Bottom Line has 0 members. I'm on the ballot, and they actually have several elected positions in town, including the mayor. But they have no members because in Connecticut, people tend to join the 2 larger parties to vote in those primaries. And the Bottom Line is an excellent case of that. Both the extreme Democrats that are in that group and the extreme Republicans won't give up their primary vote. But I petitioned on all 3 lines. I got enough signatures so that I'm likely to be able to run on all 3 lines if the 2 minor parties get the paperwork into the Secretary of State. I'll show up on a Green or Bottom Line on the ballot. And I've already been told by the Secretary of State's office that I had enough signatures to qualify as none. So I'm on the ballot, at least on that line so far. I found petitioning quite fascinating. I'm not thrilled with public interaction like petitioning, but after the first couple dozen, it got much, much easier. And instead of the questions being difficult, they became more like fun. But I was surprised at the wide range of things people ask. I mean, I'm a registrar, a data geek, a guy who might help you vote. And they were asking me major national policy questions, you know, abortion, gun control, and stuff. Hey, I'm just helping you make the decisions, you know. Tough issues. But I found petitioning quite interesting, and I don't know how the party would like to use the data, but I offer a piece of information about my petitioning experience. I carried 3 petitions, and both of the minor parties, I was able to get mid-80 signatures, and we needed 49, so I think I had a good buffer. The no party at all attracted far more signatures. There was a fascination with I'm tired of the 2 major parties. So this little thing here is a wanted poster made up by a neighbor of mine. Cute little thing. The picture in it depicts me in the local 4th of July parade with a little sign I made up that had an R and a D with a slash through it, implying I was. I wanted to imply that I was not a part of the 2 parties. It's been interpreted more negatively. So I'll probably try to redesign that sign. There was large acceptance of something other than the 2 major parties. In my town, 46% of the registered voters are not registered with the 2 major parties. And they seem quite anxious to have somebody run outside that environment. All right, any questions?
I have a question.
Sure, Mike.
In Hartford, the registrar of voters for the Working Families Party came in. There were roughly 78 registered voters in the Working Families Party. Now, after 3 years and $160,000 in salary, we now have 172 registered voters in the Working Families Party.
Mm-hmm.
So a grand total of about 80 additional have been added at about $160,000. Divide that out. But anyway, what I just wanted to ask you was, you know, what would be your goal in terms of registering Greens or any other party for that matter? You know, Do you have any like idea of numbers, or how would you do that? Or,
Well, I hadn't really thought about it in terms of numbers. I had a sense of a goal that would be more like the percentage of those eligible to vote would be a reasonable target. In our town, that's a little difficult to establish exactly how many people are citizens of the right age, because the census data isn't in the same districts as our voting and our registration. And in my town, we have a very large number of people who are not citizens. But we do have a large number of Puerto Ricans who are not registered, and who are registered at some address they had relatively recently, but not currently. And thus, when they go to vote, they have a particularly negative experience. So I've been working with registration stuff as I petitioned. I found that while I was petitioning was an ideal time to get this data. So
no, I mean, I applaud the idea of you actually going out there and getting people to be registered, because obviously there's an issue with Romantic and every major city. But I mean, in terms of the Green Party itself or the other parties, do you see yourself in terms of like wanting to try to get some more members to sign up for the Green Party, for these other parties?
I do want to make sure people understand that they don't need to register with the party of the person who's asking. So if I'm asking as a Green, I want to make sure people understand that they still have a choice, that there's less pressure. Because I have been on alleged nonpartisan voter registration drives where who gave you the clipboard seemed to have a lot to do with what checkbox got assisted on the paperwork. Some registration drives are not exactly pretty in terms of how much help the potential voter is getting in filling out that paperwork. So, yeah, so I'm interested in that. But I might offer, Tom, your question is that when we had our endorsement review meeting in Windham, we had an unregistered voter and an unaffiliated voter attend. And since then, the unregistered voter, a Hispanic, has signed up with the Green Party, which I found exciting because the Hispanics in town are vastly underrepresented. And I was quite pleased to see that he signed up with us. And then his wife also signed up just a few days ago. And so we have 2 more Greens in Windham than we used to out of this little meeting. And we had about 35 real Greens, 44 listed, but only 35 are still in town. Because we have a lot of bad data in our town. It's hard to believe. But we managed to get 2 so far in this campaign, 2 more Green. And last night, in our 3rd Thursday Street Fest here in our town, I got a voter who was chain smoking at the library in the shadows. This was somebody you don't usually get to sign up to vote. I know her well enough over the years that it's possible she'll even come out in November. But this was a street person that had been ignored in previous voter registration drives. She's always in front of the library. Where she lives is obvious. This guy.
18% is very doable because both of my congressional campaigns, I think I got about 10% in Windham, largely due to friends and supporters like Gene and others in the community. And we all know that Willimantic is an enlightened community to begin with, and it's the poetry capital of the world, and so on. But it's very achievable, I think, certainly in that area. And the other question I have, actually the first question I have, is voter ID is something that is coming up nationally, and you might have gotten some questions when you were ballot petitioning on that. I guess my way of thinking is that it excludes a lot of the lower income people because they can't get a voter ID, they don't have transportation, it's expensive for them and everything else. I was just wondering what your feelings are.
I have some pretty strong feelings on that. I was talking with Gene on the way up here about this because tomorrow we're having a neighborhood get-together at the house of a gentleman who asked me about photo ID. A more conservative person than I am, but his concern was there were all these people running around voting and didn't know who they were or wasn't sure who they were and were they really citizens and such. So he was very concerned about this issue. And I tried to bring this into perspective for him. I happen to know through the neighborhood association that he lives in the house his grandfather built. He was born in town. For him to get a birth certificate is a matter of a 4-block walk and a small fee. And when I'm in town hall, I can see people routinely getting birth certificates, and I'm jealous. I have a copy of mine, wrinkled, worn, useless. It's the short form, and it's only a copy. It's not embossed. I can't use it for jack anymore. You know, decades ago, I could still use it to do things, but these days nobody accepts it for anything. My expired passport no longer helps me get across the border or identify myself to an employer. And so all I have left is my Connecticut driver's license. If I lose it, I am out of luck. I would have to travel 400 miles to my city of birth with a biblical journey. And I might get it, and I might not. Baltimore has, Maryland has a stern reputation being near DC and Homeland Security concerns of being very difficult about issuing replacement birth certificates. And so I was able to share this with my neighbor and basically tell him, it makes sense from where you're sitting. You can get this stuff easy. It doesn't cost you much and it's nearby and easy. For me, it's a 400-mile journey. It will be expensive. I haven't been employed for 2 years, and I'm seeing that differently as a hurdle to my continuing to vote and continuing to be employed in this state. And so I sympathize with people who want to make sure that people aren't voting twice, but that's not where I think people are voting twice. It's showing up and doing it the hard way is probably not how people are going to cheat. I've done poll work enough, done enough audits for the state of Connecticut on the voting to know that if I wanted to cheat, I'd follow Bridgeport's model. They've laid the groundwork. It's not so hard. You just fingerprint the ballots and then print a whole bunch extra to help out later. And if somebody asks, gee, do you have the list of voters who voted? You tell them you will in a few minutes and bring out the list later. The ink was still warm. It was unattractive.
Well, you know, that's not that uncommon. This is a relatively small group. I would have a similar problem. I was born in Virginia. When I retired from the state service after 27 years, I had to have a copy of my birth certificate in order to fill out the retirement papers and everything else so that my meager pension check would get to the right place. And the name I had when I was born is different from the name I have now because of a very tough Irish priest who insisted on the name of a saint as one of the names in order to baptize me. And the state raised some issues about it. So if I had to get a voter ID and I didn't have a driver's license, I would be in much the same situation.
Sure. And of course, half the population, most women and many Hispanics, have challenging name circumstances after multiple weddings and divorces, and don't have names that match their paperwork for much simpler reasons. And so I'm not fond of strict photo ID. In Windham, we had a pattern for a decade or so where the registrars and the moderators were insisting on photo ID. And all Connecticut required was that you prove your residence. Are you from Windham? Magazine label will do. Something printed by a computer, not by your own hand. But routinely, the checkers were asking for driver's licenses, a far higher threshold. And of course, in a town full of 8,000 renters, many of whom don't have a parking space for a car, driver's licenses aren't all that common among our 13,000 voters. We have students, many of whom have never had a driver's license yet, and most of whom do not have cars. And then we have people who can barely afford subsidized rent, much less fancy paperwork. Jane, you had a question?
I had two. I was going to say, I think it would be helpful if you addressed, in light of that question, how do we prevent voter fraud? Because it's probably a legitimate concern. And then my second question was kind of a reflection on what you said, Mike, which is, given the data is bad, this is the data geek question. And we know that probably 40% of the voter names that are on the list are bad. If we clean up the voter registration list, how would you ever measure increasing voter registration when you're almost going to be working the opposite direction for starters? And so how can we measure success, which is what Mike is
Well,
saying?
you
How
could
can we
measure
say we
success
have
by
registered voters?
Voters added. Not necessarily the number of voters increasing or decreasing, but number of new voters. You could also measure perhaps accuracy. How many of the pieces of mail do you send out come back? Because in Windham, that would be a great improvement. If you want to communicate with voters in my town, you're going to spend a lot of money that goes nowhere. And if you send it the cheapest way, you don't get it back. If you use the bulk rate, for instance, the mail, you don't realize how badly you've been misled about where voters live. If, on the other hand, you do targeted mailings, pick the top 100, whatever, people who vote most often, oldest people, youngest people, whatever you might feel, and watch how many of those come back. Or mail to 100 property owners and 100 renters. And you find that there's a statistic that could be improved that way. So you could measure yourself that way if you had the budget to do test mailings.
Okay, I hate to move this on,
Yeah, well,
but we better move
we
it
have
on.
other candidates.
And you all should know Doug was endorsed to run as a green candidate on the Green Line. And there is a sign-up sheet there if anyone wants to help with his campaign. And